I am certainly not a person that says you should just go with, but I'm also not the guy that says you need to pick a fight with everybody out there. There's something to faithful presence and faithful proclamation that produces the kind of fruit that Jesus is calling us to.
Welcome to the Stetzer ChurchLeaders Podcast, where we're helping Christian leaders navigate and lead through the cultural issues of our day. My name's Daniel Yang, National Director of Churches of Welcome at World Relief, and today we're talking with Matt Chandler. Matt's an elder and lead pastor at the Village Church in Flower Mound, Texas, and the executive chairman of the Acts 29 Network. He's authored several books, including his latest, The Overcomers, God's Vision for You to Thrive in an Age of Anxiety and Outrage. You can sign up for Matt's newsletter and check out his podcast, The Overcomers, at PastorMattChandler.com. Now let's go to Ed Stetzer, Editor-in-Chief of Outreach Magazine and the Dean of the Talbot School of Theology.
Well, Matt, thanks again for being back on the podcast. And I just got to start at the beginning, maybe at the end. Book of Revelation? Like, really? Like how many people are writing a Book of Revelation book in 2024 that's nothing like this? So tell us why the Book of Revelation fits into this.
Well, so I think what was driving me in the beginning was I wanted pastors and leaders and then the everyday man or woman in the pews to remember and grasp that, like, as janky as this moment of history is, it's our moment, and that like no one's coming to bail us out of this. Like, we are God's big plan for this exact situation. So C.S. Lewis isn't coming. G.K. Chesterton isn't coming. They might not do well if they were here. It's been given to us. And I saw, like, almost everywhere I was looking, I saw either an acquiescing to culture or just a shut down and be silent because we don't want to. I don't know if we'll have time for this, but I see like the false gospel of empathy and compassion. I don't mean that we're not to have those things, because we are. But I think when the world defines those terms and then you lay that across our faith, you get people that acquiesce or get silent. And I think if we do that, we're going to miss this moment. So that was the driver. And then in some other reading I was doing, it clicked that, oh my gosh, the book of Revelation for 2,000 years has been given to God's people for such a time as this, to put steel in our spines, to let us see the victory of Christ, to encourage us in the mission. And it's only been in the last 150 years it's been hijacked by what I would call some janky theology. I'm not trying to start a fight with anybody. I'm just saying it's 150 years old, and I just think we should be a little bit more skeptical of that.
It's 150 years old. You're talking about a pre-tribulational view. You're talking about millennialism. That's
I think no. Those things go all the way back. More the dispensational kind of idea of reading Revelation through the lens of the newspaper.
Okay.
And so maybe even those two are separate things. Maybe there's far. In fact, I probably overstated. There probably is far more people who read Revelation through the newspaper rather than read the newspaper through Revelation.
Yeah.
And so, like, gosh, we just got a prime example of that in the eclipse, where my office even got called going, do you want to speak into the spiritual significance of the eclipse? And I'm like,
this was back in April. And of course, those of you who don't know, there was an eclipse. Those of you listening to other countries, it was an eclipse in America, which of course meant that it's an eschatological sign for the rest of the world because of American dates and things of that sort. But yeah, it was a little much. And I got to tell you, I even tweeted, does anybody really know anybody who says this? And then everyone pointed me to people that are saying this.
They're saying it. Yeah. So I wanted to write some courage into this moment. And Revelation does that, I think, better than any other book in the Bible, probably because of who is being written to and their moment of history. And so that's how we got to. And then, man, I feel most comfortable in a text. I feel most comfortable preaching out of a text, writing out of a text. And so that's just where I'm most comfortable. So I had this thing burning inside of me. And then I had this book of the Bible that's been given to the church across, human history to build her up this way. And so to me, they married perfectly.
Yeah, and I think a lot of Christians don't know what to do with the book of Revelation. And so I like that you leaned in on that. But the burning question that I think you need to answer before we could even decide if we want to have any more conversation with you: amill, post-mill, pre-mill. Are you pre-mill like Jesus and all the disciples were, or some other crazy view that you have?
Okay, we're going to go straight for the millennial reign, huh?
Just go for it. Just get. I just want to know.
So
Then we can get to the themes of the book. But right now, this is what
great.
people are deciding whether not to listen
I
to
know.
anything else you
I
have to
know.
say based on your millennial view.
I am most amill to anything else, although I've got a lot of post-mill sympathies.
Thank you for taking the time, everybody. But thanks for being on our podcast. We're going to wrap it up here as well. All right. So,
and I know where you land.
Yeah, pre-mill. I've got pre-mill. Just like the early church, it's kind of a thing. Is that right? But anyway, the key thing is, and even throughout this, and I really want to encourage people to check out the book. Again, it's called The Overcomers, God's Vision for You to Thrive. And then it kind of brings right to today in an age of anxiety and outrage. So it's not really a book about eschatological signs or things of that sort. It is talking about overcoming. But again, there's so many, even in the title, like what's our posture in overcoming? As a matter of fact, when you talk about a little post-mill in there, I mean, some of what our posture is, you sort of talk about being courageous and confident a lot. And there's a whole lot of people who don't like you and me who say that this is what courageous and confident looks like. And then you're saying we should be courageous and confident. And then some people say, well, ways to be courageous is to lose well and just take the culture as it comes. So how would we be courageous and confident in 2024 and beyond when that means different things to different people?
Yeah, and this is where I think like the Bible has to define our terms and not this current moment defining our terms. And so what you see early on in the book of Revelation is a call to both contend with and to live in a way that is opposite of the prevailing culture of their day. In fact, in each one of the letters to the churches, I get the phrase overcomers from the letters to the churches, right, where in each one he's like, and to he who overcomes, I will give. To he who overcomes, I will give. And in each one of those instances, he's calling them actually to stand against cultural norms as a picture of God's good design and beauty. And so I certainly am not, I am certainly not a person that says you should just go with, but I'm also not the guy that says you need to pick a fight with everybody out there. There's something to faithful presence and faithful proclamation that produces the kind of fruit that Jesus is calling us to. So even if you think about the early church, so 96 AD, that 30 years of immense persecution, like what you get is a picture of a group of people that are bearing all these trials with a fierce tenacity. They're not giving into it. They're multiplying quietly. They're building order while their enemies generate chaos. They're fighting the sword with the word, brutality with hope. And by doing that, they defeated the strongest state that history has ever known. And so I read this little quote, I think it was Will Durant in his Story of Civilization, that Christ or Caesar and Christ had met in the arena and Christ had won. And he didn't win, or Christ didn't win with the sword. And he didn't win. He won with the ferocious, everyday faithfulness of average people, not blue check, famous, charismatic communicators that are bold in the sense that maybe some people will call you or I bold. No, this was a faithful blacksmith. This was a faithful housewife. This was a faithful stay-at-home mom, if you will, living the gospel out faithfully in their neighborhoods, in their workplaces, refusing to capitulate to the culture while simultaneously creating with their lives a plausibility structure that ran contrary to the cultural norms.
So is this, some might ask, so I'll ask, is this like a dog whistle to say, have faithful presence, don't get too much involved in politics, don't get too caught up in arguing, kind of calm down a little? You use the word outrage in the title. Is this a dog whistle that we're getting too involved in some of those things? I mean, it is 2024. So
no, I don't. Yeah, I know. No, I don't think that's what I write, or I have that in view while I write. Now, here's what I'll say. I probably have that in view for some folks.
Yeah.
But certainly not as like the normal way of operating. Yeah. I think we're called to be faithful citizens where we are. And I think policy matters because people matter. And I think there's types of policies that Christians everywhere should fight for. And I think there are types of policies where Christians everywhere should fight against. And I also think this has been true throughout Christian history. It's not just the mess we're in 2024. And so, no, this isn't, hey, everybody sit down and just be sweet, nice people. This is to live boldly in our day, pointing out truth and reality wherever we can.
Yeah. And overcome is the language means different things to different people, right? So there are people who are overcoming the forces, and they're overcoming the forces by any means necessary in some of their mind. But you actually define this, and you look at the qualities you see in Scripture. So what are some of the qualities that you're bringing forth as an overcomer?
Yeah, so I think the main one that I'm trying to embed in the imaginations, and maybe for the preacher teacher in their mouths, is a perpetual surrender to the rule and reign of God in our lives, especially when it's hard. And so the way that we primarily overcome is to repeatedly surrender to the reign and rule of God, because Paul's language is unbelievably political. Jesus's language is unbelievably political. That little "Jesus is Lord" phrase, you can throw that on a red hat. I mean, it's who's not Lord if Jesus is? Caesar. And even in Revelation, specifically when you get into chapters 12 and 13, clearly what's in view right there is Rome, and then the imperial cults in Rome. So these religious bodies that are going to put your trust in the government, put your trust in the government, put your trust in the government. So what we're seeing in the book of Revelation, and I think what's right and good for today, is wherever God has uniquely placed us in this moment, our role is a repeated surrender to the rule and reign of God in our lives. And I think overcoming is doing that, especially when it's hard, and not look for the way to be silent or to acquiesce.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be hard. I think 2024 may be some of the peak of our cultural convulsion. I think we're probably better prepared as churches, where we're a little less prepared in 2020. But I mean, the culture, the months ahead of us could be some of the most tumultuous in our lifetime. And it's not just like American politics, but we're talking about, war. We're waiting for war in Asia. We've got a war in the Middle East. We've got war in Europe. So, this is where I think, I've been teaching, Wednesday night, we're doing a series on the renewal of all things, just a series I did at church. And you can't talk about those things without talking about Revelation a lot and what it looks like at the end of the book of Revelation. But there's always this draw. Maybe it's a Southern California thing. People are like, could you talk more about the book of Revelation and the end times? And you kind of resisted that urge. I made you have a little fun with me and talk about millennialism, but
sure.
But you kind of resisted that urge. So is that something? Because remember, our audience is pastors and church leaders. How should they speak of these things, and why then did you even go to the book of Revelation? I mean, I know you love to work through a book, but the book of Revelation just conjures up so much else. How can pastors talk about our current moment without fueling that kind of, it's all, any moment, it's all Jesus is going to come? Well, I want them to live as if Jesus is going to come back, but I think you understand my question.
I do. Yeah, well, I think you've got to let Revelation be what it is. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is in the first 5-6 chapters, you find out what it is. Like, we know it's a letter. I mean, he's clear. This is who I'm writing to the 7 churches of Asia Minor. It's a prophecy, but not so much this is what the future is, although there is plenty of that in the book of Revelation. It's more, thus saith the Lord. I mean, gosh, even in the first 5 verses, he says, and he who does the things that are in this book. So it's a book of discipleship. And then lastly, it's an apocalypse, right? It's an unveiling. And that unveiling, though, I found in study, is not just how this is going to end, but what's true right now. The unveiling is the victory of Christ right now, regardless of what we see. And so he's certainly saying to the original hearer, no matter how great the empire of Rome looks to you, Christ is on his throne, and all history and creation is moving towards him in worship. And that's available to us right now. That's not some future happening. That's true right now. And so if those are my lenses, And the apocalyptic literature in Revelation is mostly pointing backwards, not forwards. I think I read in one commentary there's over 500 allusions to the Old Testament in the book of Revelation. Eugene Peterson went so far as to say there's nothing in Revelation that hasn't already been said somewhere else in the Bible. If we approach it that way, then it isn't as weird as I'm afraid it's been made over the last couple of years. And it gives us some confidence that the locust probably isn't the Apache helicopter.
I mean, that's what I was taught. So I don't know how you could say that. So,
well, yeah, because nobody was wrong in the 70s about eschatology. But I think eschatology matters. I think we're pulled forward with future hope. I think there's a good, right longing for eschatology. I think there's a good, right teaching of eschatology that strengthens the inner man. But I also think it's a place that they forget the present at the expense of. And Revelation, read rightly, doesn't have you forget the present at the expense of the future. It anchors you in future hope for present boldness. And I think that's what the book does when it's read through those three lenses of it's a letter, it's a prophecy, and it's an apocalypse.
Yeah, and I think, again, that's, I think, what The Overcomers does. Again, it's called The Overcomers, God's Vision for You to Thrive in an Age of Anxiety and Outrage. We don't know, the book is clearly geared towards a broader Christian audience. And we actually don't do a lot of interviews about books kind of geared towards a broader Christian audience. But, partly I just wanted you to kind of articulate some of what that vision might look like for pastors and church leaders as well. Because one of the things you talked about that I resonated with was that the Western church is under a sort of satanic lullaby. Yeah. Why don't you unpack that a little bit as well? The Stetzer ChurchLeaders Podcast is part of the Church Leaders Podcast Network, which is dedicated to resourcing church leaders in order to help them face the complexities of ministry today. The Church Leaders Podcast Network supports pastors and ministry leaders by challenging assumptions, by providing insights, and offering practical advice and solutions and steps that will help church leaders navigate the variety of cultures and contexts that we're serving in. Learn more at ChurchLeaders.com/podcast network.
Yeah, well, when I wrote that, I was actually quoting an Iranian house church leader who was asked about the West. And I almost always have my antennas up about people dogging Western Civ. I think for all the good that we've brought to bear on the earth, we should get a little grace on some of the nitpicky stuff. But what he said, I thought really resonated in my own heart, my own experience as an evangelical pastor. He said it was like the West had been put to sleep, like it was napping, like it was on some sort of cruise ship. It was like in the, John Piper's famous kind of cruise ship versus battleship mentality. And this Iranian pastor basically described us as sleeping or being lulled to sleep, a demonic lullaby, he says. And I think the majority of evangelicals that I come across are almost completely unaware of this cosmic war they find their lives caught up in. And it's not a war of equal footing. It's not a war where the outcome's not known, but very much there's this battle in the cosmos. There's this battle behind what we can see, smell, touch, taste, and experience that is God, the creator, conquering his foes and humanity caught in the middle of it. And this Iranian pastor was saying that the Western church doesn't seem to have any imagination for this. And I think that's been pastored the same church for 22 years, been in ministry for 30 years now. The sheer volume of moral navel gazing that's now been framed up as Christianity, it easily shows that we're dead asleep to this reality of this cosmic war that's being waged that we're in the middle of.
Yeah, so I don't disagree with that, but I would also say too, the question is, how do you respond to that? I'm a little older than you, but there's a very famous song by Keith Green called "Asleep in the Light," and
come on,
and I think that's sort of where we are. We are kind of asleep in the light. But I think I can find a whole lot of people who would say that means you got to punch harder and
No,
fight
gosh, no.
harder and
Yeah.
wage and maybe wage the culture war more. So you're coming to it's almost like you're coming to the same conclusion of people who have concluded that the answer is very different from the answer that you're bringing forward. So how do you explain that?
Yeah, well, I think what I'm trying to do is take my cues from the way that the church in 96 AD took these cues. I don't think, like, I can't find anywhere that I've read and researched. If you found it, it's too late now. You could let me know, and I'll have to write a couple of blogs going, here's where I missed it. And certainly I probably did miss some things. The church's response to what they received from John was not, let's war against these temple prostitutes. Let's war against, let's punch harder. And in fact, even that phrase earlier, they fought the sword with the word, right? Where their enemies generated chaos, they got set creating order. And so I think, honestly, one of the ways you can punch back, like, here's something we do every October. It's the most spiritually violent thing I think we do as a church. Every October, we have a month of prayer where we encourage all the families of our congregation to simply prayer walk their neighborhoods and pray prayers of blessings over each of the homes, whether they know the people or not. And then every Sunday night, we gather together for worship and prayer together, and we'll share testimonies of that prayer walking. And it has always led to salvation. It has always led to spiritual conversations. It's because they're walking, and then here's their neighbor they hadn't met. What are you doing? Oh, I'm praying a blessing over your house, praying a blessing over your marriage. Oh, well, why would you do that? And now and not a single instance in 5 years of this has someone gone, how dare you? You keep those prayers to yourself. Well, this is the kind of spiritual combat that overcomers do, right? And I'm not saying there isn't a time and place to punch harder. I'm just saying the way that the early church responded to the images and the cries of God through John to the churches is not punch harder the way we think about punching harder. Right. But to fight where the fight's actually occurring, which is these principalities and powers, as Paul labels them, and what we see as the dragon and his two henchmen in, of course, Revelation 12 and 13.
So, and it's interesting how many people will know, like, all those references they know, but they know them from maybe books in the 70s. Yeah. And you do take a very different take. And again, I encourage people to pick up the book. And again, it's The Overcomers, God's Vision for You to Thrive in an Age of Anxiety and Outrage. You've said 96 AD a few times, and I think, in a sense, you're how the church is responding at that cultural moment. So let me ask you, though, because this would be, we're taking different, people take different conversation, different directions.
Yeah.
But for me, it's 2024 when this podcast will come out. So we're trying to figure out what's our posture in a culture that has become, we've lost our home field advantage. Christians are on the other side of the cultural divide from the majority of culture. They're often seen as the problem, not the solution. So then I guess the question becomes, is 96 AD and the instructions to the church as, kind of the ways, very flowery descriptions of how do those instructions come, are those the right time, or should we look at Boniface when he goes in and cuts down the sacred oak of Thor? Should we look at how Christians re-evangelized the continent and pushed back worshippers of Odin and other things, and sometimes went to battle to do that? Yeah. So why 96 AD as this is what the church did, therefore we should do that?
Yeah. So the perspective I'm coming from is that the way they responded in 96 AD gives birth to maybe other lanes and other methodologies at other times. And so if I'm looking out at evangelicalism right now, its leaders and its people, I don't see a ton of the bearing all trials with fierce tenacity, or multiplying quietly, or building order while their enemies generate chaos. To me, it looks like we're caught up in a meme war with people who are better at it than we are. Except, you got a couple of, I'd leave the Babylon Bee alone. I think they kind of punch at that level. But the enduring with brutality, with hope, like that's the stuff that at last defeated the strongest state history has ever known. And so even in the ones you're naming, that doesn't lead to, I think, what this way of leaning into God's plan. And I would also argue that some of the examples that you're using are actually using the weapons of the enemy, and then you become the enemy. Okay. Where this is the path where I want to say you don't become the enemy, but certainly Christendom created a whole new mess. And so maybe the reality that all of us are going to have to live under is that thorns spring up even by the sweat of our brow. Yeah. But that the best we can hope for is to live bold, normal Christian lives in our neighborhoods and workplaces and places of play, and to create order and multiply with depth as much as it depends on us.
Well, you can tell that I'm on the same page. We've talked about this, alone many times. Bold, normal Christian lives. So here's now kind of flowing from that, right? Because you preach this series that became the book. I think it was 21.
Yep.
So, but now it's 24. So how are you not going to repreach the series that you've released as a book? So how are you going to lead the Village Church in the next few months in what could be the most tumultuous time in your ministry? What are some ways you're going to lead it, and maybe draw from some of the things you learned in the Revelation series?
So my plan as of now, and let me talk air war, not all the other things. I do a 3-week series on the gospel every fall. It's just a gospel primer. If you read my first book, Explicit Gospel, I'm like, I don't want to get away from this. So every fall we're going to kick off, numbers are up. The fall started. Everybody's going to serve Jesus faithfully this fall. We're all at church again from summer break. I'm going to do a 3-week gospel primer. And then I'm going to go into a 6-week, starting in October, a 6-week message on how to live faithfully in this moment that I'm calling Thrones and Thorns. And my plan is to just walk through. Really, the flow is going to be, week one's kind of creator equals king, and I want to show that God's right is to reign and rule over it all, and then watch him ordain, or however we want to say it, Adam and Eve to be those viceroys of that kingdom, and then watch sin break that into 1,000 pieces. That'd be week one. Week two, I want to look at the Tower of Babel. I want to look at what happens when people say, we'll make God come down and serve us. And then in week 3, after that, I want us to look back at Revelation, specifically at the 2 beasts that the dragon calls out of, one out of the sea, one out of the dirt. And let's talk about how the more governments make man the end, the more bestial they become, the more demonic they become. And then after that week, I want to go over to Romans. This is the purpose of government. And it'll be that week where I talk about how policy matters, because people matter. And so there are certain policies that Christians should be behind. And there are certain policies that Christians should adamantly oppose. And I'll give some examples of that to get myself in trouble, because one party doesn't own all the right ones. And then I want to move from there to Jesus is Lord in week 5. Like, what is the Bible doing? What is Paul doing with this Jesus is Lord thing? Because it's a wildly political statement in the time it was written.
Yeah, but you have to explain. Not everyone will know that. You mentioned that, but explain why Jesus is Lord.
At the moment, there were, as Caesar comes to power, you've got all these like kings and regents that begin to build temples to them and to curry favor, and sometimes from the Caesar's order itself. Like I think of Vespasian. Vespasian was huge on call me Lord, I'm a god. And like this idea of Caesar as Lord was the way that it was the Heil Hitler. It was the way that you greeted Caesar. Caesar is Lord. So to say that Jesus is Lord is to say that Caesar is not Lord. And it was probably, depending on, where you dig, it was probably one of the things that got Paul in prison. And maybe even one of the reasons, or maybe even why Paul thought he had done his job ending up in prison, by creating these little bastions of ambassadors of the real king. Because the gospel in 1 Corinthians is Jesus is king. It's that Jesus is the Messiah. He's the fulfillment of Israel's promise. And now greater than that, he's the king of the whole world, which of course the Romans probably thought was the most absurd thing imaginable, that out of Judea could come some king of the world. And so that will be week 5. And then the last week is what it means to be an ambassador of this king in this day and age. How do you live faithfully? So I'm going 6 weeks hard. I'm going to swing at it. I'm going to address Christian nationalism, which is just basically anything that's conservative. Let me say this. I think there actually is kind of Christian nationalism that's absurd and out of control. But I think by and large, we get bullied into not saying anything, because anything a Christian says about politics now is framed as Christian nationalism to discredit, which to me seems like a propaganda ploy that's pretty effective.
I as someone who's written on the issue of life in CNN and USA Today, and defended biblical marriage in USA Today and more, and to see all that now lumped under Christian nationalism. As someone who's written about Christian nationalism,
I know. Well, that's the irony. Yeah,
to get lumped into that. But you're right. It's a catch-all. So, and when this series you're doing, is this right before the election?
Yeah, it'll start in October. It'll end right as the election is happening.
Well, that's pretty aggressive. So I think a lot of pastors are thinking, let me just kind of keep my head down through the election, maybe preach through, preach through the book of Leviticus so people can focus somewhere else.
Something easier.
Yeah, something easier. So I mean, 2020, 2016, similar, or is this sort of like a little more aggressive posture, or what?
I think my bent is always to go right at something.
Okay.
And I would say, if a pastor's listening to this, I think you need to know where you are. Like, I've been at the Village Church for 22 years, and we have endured some pretty epic highs and some pretty terrible lows. And I have just a lot of leeway to go at them like this. I think if you're in year 1, I would maybe figure out a way to do something, but maybe not being as aggressive as I'm describing. I just think that's why, even Jesus said to his disciples once, I have other things to say, but you're not ready to hear them. And so maybe you do a series on the Imago Dei, and you're just talking about how you can come at some things through a series on the Imago Dei.
Yeah, or bring in a guest speaker. I was asked to preach at one large church in Illinois, like a couple weeks before the election, and then they told me the topic just a couple weeks out. We want you to preach on the election. I'm like, what? Huh? That's your pastor's job, not your guest speaker's job. But
you're right. I'm sure you did great.
Yeah,
sure. You didn't cause that guy any issues when you left. No,
I never do. Never. I'm not going to cause issues for any of my friends.
You're not that guy.
So we're coming to the end. So come back to the empower, the overcomers theme, excuse me, because the pastors, again, the book, for those who remember, the overcomers, God's vision for you to thrive in an age of anxiety and outrage. So how do pastors lean into that as an overcomer in their own lives? And I want to ask you how they teach their people to do that as well, but start with pastors.
Yeah, I think the answers are going to be similar. I think if pastors haven't done that deep work around identity, and are still having some significant struggles with like internal accusation and comparison, it's going to be really hard to kind of live into this moment that we're in. I need to know, and I don't mean like theologically or intellectually, I need to know in my guts that before I'm anything else in this world, I'm a son of God. I am a child of the King. And I need to find great comfort in that and live to please him as opposed to others. Now, I don't mean to believe that in such a way that you're a fool. I just mean to have a real sturdy, in my guts understanding of what my identity is and what it's not. Because if they can fire Jonathan Edwards, they can fire anybody. But can I preach and live and cast vision in a way that is faithful to Jesus and takes into account where the people that he's asked me to shepherd are? I just think brothers and sisters have to do that work. They have to know I'm secure in his love. I am not trying to earn the favor of God or for God to work in my church, or I am beloved by him, not some future version of me right now. And then, man, I know the predominant atonement theory of the day, but there's something about that Christus Victor that needs to be reclaimed. And if you look back on the early church, and I just think they had something in that victory of Christ over everything, because it feels to me like I'm walking with 5 or 6 Gen Z guys now, and I've always got pastors in my orbit that I'm working with. There seems to be real anxiety about being canceled or being, and I like to, and again, it's why I love Revelation. Revelation has the victory of Christ on display as the driving narrative of our lives, Christ enthroned. So we keep returning to that throne room until it comes down to earth, either pre or post or middle or whatever, Ed. But the scene is Christ on his throne, draped in ultimate victory, that he then is handing that victory to his people. And I want to grab hold of the victory of Christ and live out of that. And you will, I think, preach, teach, and lead differently with a robust understanding of just how significant and all-encompassing the victory of Christ is, and then lead out of that. Otherwise, I'm judging things on my victories and my losses, and those could be catastrophic. Even my good victories could end up being catastrophic. And so those are the things, especially with pastors, that I'm trying to help with is primary identity. You're going to be a better preacher, a better leader, a better husband, a better dad when you understand who you are and who you belong to. And then I think this idea of the victory of Christ is just huge. I think it's what drove the early church so often. I mean, that's why I've read plenty about how really the resurrection was so the focus more than the cross for the first several hundred years. Like he's alive. He beat death. He overcame the enemy. And I'm not diminishing the cross, of course, because that's how he did it. But the resurrection of Christ was this kind of the force that was bringing people into the kingdom of God.
The Overcomers, God's Vision for You to Thrive in an Age of Anxiety and Outrage. I think it'll be a good resource for pastors and church leaders listening. Matt, appreciate you. Very excited that we just announced at the Acts 29 meeting that we now have an Acts 29 Talbot School of Theology academic partnership. Excited about all the good things to come, and appreciate you and the way you want to encourage pastors and church leaders. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Always good to be with you, Ed.
We've been talking to Matt Chandler. Be sure to check out his new book, The Overcomers, God's Vision for You to Thrive in an Age of Anxiety and Outrage. Learn more about Matt and check out his newsletter and podcast at pastormattchandler.com. And thanks again for listening to the Stetzer Church Leaders Podcast. You can find more interviews as well as other great content for ministry leaders at ChurchLeaders.com/podcast and through our new podcast network at ChurchLeaders.com/podcast network. And again, if you found our conversation helpful today, I'd love for you to take a few moments, leave us a review. That'll help other ministry leaders find us and benefit from our content. Thanks for listening. We'll see you in the next episode.